like to now begin with the presentation. First, before that, I would like to request Mr. Eric Winter-Smith. He's the team leader for Dakchyata, who will introduce the project and share our objectives on greening TVET. Eric joins us from Denmark. He's working from Denmark, of course, because of the COVID situation, and he has been leading Dakchyata team since July 2018. In his long career, Eric has been managing a string of programs and projects in general education and in TVET, so he comes with a lot of body of work. So over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Reshu. And with these kind words, now you have a video link. You can see that I'm blushing with all this flatter. Anyway, let's jump right into it. To open this webinar, let me first of all welcome all participants to this third Dakchyata webinar, all of which have been raising burning issues in TVET of Nepal. This webinar will be focusing on seeing TVET as an engine for green growth. The thing with green economy and environmental issues is that we all carry some responsibility, big or small, but we have to narrow in on that responsibility. I think you all know the saying, everybody's responsibility is nobody's responsibility. Dakchyata's responsibility is captured in some sentences in our founding document, which reads like this, and now I quote: "The specific objective is to strengthen and implement more effective policy in the TVET sector, responsive to labor market needs. The program is piloting an integrated public-private partnership approach in 3 key economic sectors: 1, agriculture, 2, construction, and 3, tourism, offering opportunities for promoting the transition to a greener, climate-resilient, low-emission economy." So this is the mandate that we are talking from. But how should we do this? What's a good way forward? In a webinar like today, one good way is to alert all key players towards their key responsibilities, which will be different according to their role and function in TVET. Allow me to mention 3 angles of approach. First of all, we hope this webinar will make TVET practitioners more alert. It is the TVET practitioners who are involved in TVET delivery who can check how the green agenda is reflected in what the TVET students learn about green economy and green practices. Once they learn how, then they can apply their knowledge once they get a job. This is really important, but the drive to green TVET cannot stop here. It cannot stand alone. So secondly, Dakchyata is always advocating partnership between the TVET sector and the employers who employ TVET students. Partnership in green TVET means that employers will increasingly be demanding skills of their employees to make greening of their production process possible. Employers should apply more environmental practices, but they can only do so if their employees also know how. And lastly, I am talking about influencers and policymakers who should become aware that TVET plays an important role in greening the economy, since many TVET-trained personnel have key positions in the production apparatus of a country. By changing context of learning and setting standards for production, policymakers can pave the way for employers to introduce new green technology and ensure that the country's TVET system can deliver the qualifications and skills needed to make production more environmental friendly. So we in Dakchyata hope that you all, government, employers, and TVET practitioners will gain something useful from this webinar like creating more awareness of your particular role and responsibility for TVET to become an engine for green growth. So thank you very much for joining. Once again, welcome all of you, and let's get started, please.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for sharing Dakchyata's vision on greening Tibet. Now, moving forward to the main part of the webinar, I would now like to invite Mr. Anil Chitrakar to lead us through his presentation in understanding the concept of green economy and how Tibet can be instrumental in enabling the green growth. As you all know, Mr. Chitrakar is a renowned personality in the field of environment and conservation in Nepal. We are very grateful for his support. He's helping us to embed green growth activities through Dakchyata's project. So over to you, Anil sir, for the presentation.
So thank you very much, Eric, Resu, and everybody who has joined us for this very important conversation. So I'm using the word conversation because I'm not here with a gray hair to teach. So this is a collective learning process, and so we need to all be engaged in this process. So there are two things that we really want to achieve in the next hour. And so the first is to get to some collective understanding between us as a group, as a broader network, to see, what does the green economy mean, for us. And so definitions can be different, but we really want to test and see, what does it mean for each one of us, but also what does it mean, for us collectively. And then the second part, of course, is, the training, the vocational, the technical education. So, TVET is a very nice acronym, but it stands for technical, vocational, education, and training. So these are very key words. And so what does it mean to green TVET? And so these are two parts of what we want to achieve in today's webinar. Next slide, Saurabh. Okay, so I think we can start. And so, this is how, we really plan, to get your engagement, is to ask you, so what is a green economy? So now you can use the chat box, you can, but jump in, and Resu will help us, facilitate this conversation. So let's see, what some ideas are that we can bring, from this webinar. So what is green economy? And so this is a question to all of you.
Yes, as Anil sir said, the floor is now open. This is more about sharing information with one another about, the green economy practices around the world and help us one another to understand the concept. So if you want to respond, please raise your hand and then I'll pick a name. In the interest of time, do keep your questions short, responses short, and depending on the time availability, we'll try to take maximum responses. So please, we really encourage you to speak up so that we can learn from one another.
Mm-hmm. So go ahead.
Yes, sustainable economy. Do you want to say something about this strategy?
Mm-hmm. So let's get a few more responses.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please feel free to write your response in the chat box if you don't want to speak, but we would be delighted to hear from you as well.
Mm-hmm.
So one of our partners, he asking what are the basic elements of green
Mm-hmm.
economy. So this is more of a question.
Mm-hmm.
Someone is also saying green economy refers to sustainable development. Again, one of our partner,
Mm-hmm.
sustainable economy,
Mm-hmm.
economy that protects environment. I think these are all good ideas.
Mm-hmm. Good one.
Yes, clean environment, friendly economy that promotes health, wealth, and well-being. Economy without harming the natural environment. Responsible consumption. Sustainable development again. Economy activities that does not affect the ecology. Use of local means and resources. Anyone, if you want to highlight what you are stating on the chat box, please feel free to say that as well.
Good. Use of local means and resources. Very good.
Yes.
So there's more coming.
Yes.
के अरे नवीन एकैचोटि मलाई हेडफोन चाहिँ देऊ न ल तिमीले हेर न घर
Sorry, Sonamji, can you mute yourself, please? Yes. Okay. G means sustainable development for future generation, economic activities which don't affect the future generation. I think these are very, very good ideas.
Yeah.
Yes. And so do you want to pick any of these and further highlight on those responses? Yeah.
Sure. So, one word, that you see that is common to all the responses is the word sustainable. And so it is very important, for us to understand that the word sustainable can mean many things. So, for example, right now we have the monsoon. And so imagine if we had to use a pump to get water from the Bay of Bengal, to come to the Himalayas and then to fall in Nepal, how much money, it would cost. So sustainability, as in the monsoon arrives every year and we can basically grow our rice. So if we base our lifestyle or our economy, based on the natural system like the monsoon, then we can say it is sustainable. Now, if we take a tree, and so let us say it is a fodder tree, which gives us leaves for our livestock. So every week, every month, if we lop the tree just enough so that it can grow back, so we would say the tree is within its regenerative, power. So the tree grows. And so if we harvest, then it is sustainable. Now, another very good example would be if 8 billion people, dry their clothes in the sun doesn't get smaller. So that is why solar energy is sustainable. So anything that is based on renewable, within natural systems, but also within the capacity for it to regenerate. So all of that would be sustainable. So these are really good, answers coming. Resu, you want to read a few more?
Yeah, I think we have plenty that has come in. Anyone, if you want to add more, let's just have a few more before we move on to the presentation.
Sure.
If not,
so,
we can actually, yeah.
Sure.
Please.
Yeah. So good. So just let's move to the next slide. Okay. So, the green economy is the way we have to understand, the green economy is we want to grow our wealth. Okay. So wealth creation is very important. We want to make sure that people have a job, they can work, they have gainful employment. Okay. So this should not be compromised because it is about people. It is about young people who are seeking a gainful employment. Now, the second is young people will work in an enterprise or an industry or a business. And that business is part of our ecosystem. It is part of the bigger. So the person, the enterprise, and the whole ecosystem, we have to look at it as a whole. So just from your responses, and so based on some work that we've done in the past, so look at how we are trying to define a green economy. So doing more with less. So what does that mean? It means you can replace a 100-watt bulb, which produces more heat than light, with a 7-watt CFL or compact fluorescent light, because the CFL converts more electricity into light and less into heat. Now you can replace the CFL with a LED, and the 1-watt LED will give you the same amount of light as a 100-watt bulb, but does not waste any energy in converting into heat. So that is basically a good example of doing more with less. Now the second is by design. So for example, you have an enterprise and goods move from A to B, but because you did not design it very well, I am sure there is a lot of wastage. Or the product that you're making, if it is not designed well, then you will see a lot of raw material goes to waste. So design is another part of the green economy. Now systems. So you are not alone in the enterprise. So there are people who source and supply you raw materials. They are part of the system. There is the municipality that disposes of your waste. There is the local river, where your wastewater might be going. And so if you do not look at the whole system, and if you think only of your business, then you are not in a green economy, because we have to understand that we're all part of a bigger system. So systems approach. Now, leveraging policy. So Eric mentioned why policy is very important. So this year, the government of Nepal has said electric vehicles will be taxed much less than diesel or petrol vehicles. So now, if you're an enterprise, you need to say, well, the government has made a policy, I need to leverage that. And so in the future, we will go for electric vehicles, and we will start by giving our staff or our people who work for us, we will give them electric motorbikes instead of diesel or petrol, because the government has made it less tax on that. Now, if you look at California, they have said that by 2030, they will not allow anybody to build gas stations. So there will be no more petrol and diesel being sold in California. So it's just a good example of policy that can be leveraged for a green economy. Now, learning from our heritage is something very critical also, because there were many things in our past that are very earth or nature friendly. And so one example I always like to give is the Chhat festival in the Tarai. And so basically people worship water, they worship the sun, and they offer green plants. And so what we need to understand is green plants are equipped with chlorophyll. So the green is chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is the only thing in the world that uses water and sunlight to produce its own food. So we are all dependent on green. So hence the word green, because it means it uses the sun and water to basically produce. Now, economics is the second part of the word, and you just need to understand the word eco comes from the Greek word ekos, which means house. So the planet Earth is the house for 8 billion people. And nomics means numbers. So everything can be converted into numbers. So for example, if you look at climate change, 417 particle per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is too many. We need to bring it down to 350. So numbers. My bulb is 100 watt. I brought it to 7 watts, and then I brought it to 1 watt. So numbers, become very important. So understanding numbers, understanding what is happening to my house, our house, and understanding that we need to be self-sufficient as a plant, which relies only on water, soil, and the sun to become a producer. And so the green economy, has this very profound, definition that we can use. So Saurabh, next slide. So what does it mean, to green TVET? And so I want you to just appreciate the fact that here we have an institution that brings many, many young people, who are basically going into the job market. So A, they need to be skilled. Okay. Now, what does it mean to be skilled? Does it mean that I need to just make a profit? Does it mean that my business has to compete? And then if you can add value to that conversation and say, by saving water, by saving energy, by making sure that I'm very efficient, but also I do not produce any waste, I do not create emissions, which means carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I not only have a good business, I not only employ people, but in the meantime, I'm also helping, nature. And so we have to look at this, from a holistic, perspective. And in the next slide, I'm going to explain to you, how we're actually approaching it. But this is a good time again to stop and see what our audience, thinks. What should a green TVET look like? So over to you, Resu, again. Let's see, what our audience comes up with.
Yes, thank you, Anil sir. As again, I would like to request everyone, please feel free to use the chat box to, provide your responses. Let's make it more engaging. Let's hear from one another so that we can, support one another in understanding and bring more clarity to the idea of green TVET. So please feel free to use the chat box. And if you want to speak, please do so as well.
So what does a green TVET look like to you?
I guess, also maybe that's why most of us are here. So maybe we can proceed with the presentation, and we will have questions at the end of the presentation.
Sure.
So we'll wait until then.
Yeah. And again, feel free to put your ideas on the chat, as we move. So let's go to the next slide, Saurabh. So, when we think of, training, when we think of education, but also linking it with technology, and then also vocational as in, skilled. So vocational as in, skillful people. And so if you look at some of the issues, that I have put up, so green economy agenda. So if you are going to become a TVET student or a graduate, it is very important that the green agenda becomes part of the curriculum. So it is institutionalized. And so anybody entering the TVET system will get exposed to a very well-designed curriculum. Now, the second part is the curriculum has to be delivered really well. And so it is not enough for us to say, yes, these people now know. So knowing is easy, but we want to have graduates who also do. And so to do, you have to be motivated. You have to be exposed, practically. You need hands-on experience so that you are confident. And so for those things, we need qualified, resource persons to deliver the green economy content. Now that again needs to be supplemented, as you can see, with guidelines, which means how to, tools that are required, case studies. So for example, how many of you know that at the Bir hospital in Kathmandu, the waste is segregated into 56 different categories. And once you separate the waste into 56 categories, then there is a market, for each type of waste. So for example, just imagine mercury. You think mercury, if it gets into the waste system is a horrible thing. But if you can separate it, it is worth something in the market. So paper, plastic, rubber, right? We are used to these things, but there are so many, basic categories that we can. So best practices. So for a TVET student in Kathmandu to be able to visit Bir Hospital and actually see what is happening. And so for that, look at the next point, a network of venues for field visits to ensure that seeing is believing. So for example, if you go to the Dhulikhel Hospital, they have a wastewater treatment plant by which they recover all the gray water. And by using the gray water for gardening, for washing vehicles, for, basically sanitation, the hospital saves a lot of money every month in water bills. And so it is not very far, but seeing is believing. And then, part of the tool is the quantitative analysis. So like I mentioned, it is always good to use numbers. So for example, if we sit with the accountants in our business and we say, how much did we spend on petrol? How much did we spend on diesel? And by improving the way we do banking, how much did we save by not having to drive to the bank, but by doing banking, online? And so if you can convert those into numbers, then we will realize that, oh, my green practice is actually helping me to become profitable. It is helping me to be competitive. And so the quantitative analysis is very important because it leads to competitiveness and profitability, but also creating job opportunities for graduates. And so Eric mentioned, any graduate of the TVT system, when they join a bank, when they join an industry, when they join a manufacturing unit, they will be hired because they have these additional skills. And so every business owner, every entrepreneur is looking for good people, to come into their businesses. And so we want to make sure that creating job opportunities, for our TVT graduates also becomes part of the green economy. So these are just some ideas, that we want to put in. So next slide. So this is, I think the most important part. So Dakchyata, has taken the role of bringing, all these ideas, people, the institutions all together. So what does it mean to bring it all together? It means we want to strengthen. Okay. Now, strengthen is very interesting because there is some capacity already. People already know many things. And so we don't have to start from zero. We want to strengthen what already exists. Okay. And so for that, we have started by working with 10 pilot projects to understand where, they are and then what strengthening would be required. Okay. The second is Dakchyata is here for the long run, which means the Dakchyata team itself will become a repository. What is a repository? That means like a bank, where the guidelines, the knowledge, the tools, the case studies will all be there. And so the Dakchyata team will ensure the continuity, of this campaign. And then the third point is everything has to be mainstreamed. So what does it mean to be mainstreamed? It must be a natural way of doing business. So not because somebody told us, not because the government told us, no, because it is the right thing to do. And so when everybody starts doing it, then we can say it is mainstreamed. Okay, so next slide. So we started, working with the 10, partners, as a way to understand, how do we move ahead. And so the 10 pilots have already given us a really good understanding for how we can work with the TVET system to green the economy. And so if you look at the first point, it is the assess, just to understand, the senior staff, the middle staff, what is their understanding of green economy. So it is very important, as I said in the beginning, that we all reach a common understanding for what a green economy is. And so we need to assess, where we stand, on that. Now, the second one you can see is to design and deliver a series of capacity building trainings. Again, what does that mean? It means, for example, people say, okay, we would like to go for solar. And then one of the responses we get is, but solar is expensive. And then the training would be basically, if we remove one of our tin roofs and we put a transparent sheet on top, then the workshop will be lit with sunlight. So it's not very expensive. It can be done. But we need to understand that that's a technique. Secondly, if you use solar to heat water, that's also very cheap. And in Kathmandu, in other places in Nepal, you'll see solar energy, but for heating is not very expensive. Now, the third thing that is mentioned is using solar panels, battery, inverter, and then using it, for electricity. That can be a little expensive. But for example, if you're in agriculture and you want to use a submerged solar pump, what happens? The sun comes up, the pump begins to pump water, no need for battery, no need to have expensive storage tanks. And so solar can mean different things for different enterprises. And so what we would like to do is design and deliver a series of trainings like this, where the capacity of the enterprise is actually enhanced. And we have to do away with the notion that solar is expensive. but that initial assessment, gives us this idea. Now, the whole idea is that every business has an operation plan. Okay, so raw materials move, finished goods move. So raw materials are sourced from some places, it moves to another places. So the operational plan, that we're looking at is for an enterprise to be profitable, for it to increase the number of jobs, but also to be competitive in the market. Where in the system are there inefficiencies? So, for example, let us say there is a truck, and the truck is bringing raw material and it is only half full. So, is there a way to aggregate the demand so that when the truck comes, it is full? And what does that mean? That means we are emitting only 50% of the smoke that we are emitting when the truck has to do 2 trips. And so it looks very simple, but that's what we mean by operation. So, for example, if you're producing a lot of waste, can that waste, become a raw material for another industry? So, for example, when expensive carpets are woven in Nepal, there is a lot of wool pieces that come, when you trim the carpet. Now, those trimmed wool is still very expensive, but imagine, you make a dog blanket, or you make cushions, or you make, basic, rugs, for. So it may not be expensive like the original carpet, but you can have a secondary industry that uses carpet waste to produce something again of value. So, for example, if you're producing hot water, can the hot water be brought back, into the system so that it heats the space, so that you don't need heaters, you don't need to heat the space, and so that would be operations, planning. Now, so, you also need to understand businesses are different; they are quite diverse, and so, for example, a tourism enterprise will have to cater to a tourist industry where the tourist is becoming more and more conscious about where they stay, how they spend, what they buy. And so the tourism industry really has to understand the client. Now, if you're in construction, you need to understand that you can use bricks, you can use very efficiently fired bricks, you can also use compact mud bricks, you can also use local stones, and so the options are there. And so each industry has a slightly different thing. So when we do these assessments, sometimes 40%, 50% might be generic, useful for everybody. But then we also need to understand that 40, 50% might be very specific, to that particular industry. So in our initial, assessment, we found out, for example, water consumption is a big need. So in the 3 months of the monsoon, we are flooded, but the 9 months we have water shortage. So energy, lot of wastage, we can become much efficient in the way we use energy. Solid waste, where do we want to throw it? How much is the municipality charging? Why are we throwing the waste? But also mobility, because things are moving, people are moving. And so mobility is another area. So these are just 4, some of the top answers, we are getting in our initial working with the Dakchyata pilots. So next slide. So this is, very, important. So if you look at, how, so this is, just trying to explain, how we do it. So when we assess, we're looking at understanding of the green economy. Okay. So products and services, but now try to understand it has a backward linkage and it has a forward linkage into the economy. So the market is the forward link, but the place from where we source raw materials is the backward link. So we have to look at the entire, system. So production process means once the raw material arrives at the factory, then what actually happens, in the enterprise, itself. So equipment and machinery. So for example, you may have a water pump, you may have a lathe machine, you may have a refrigerator. And so in the market, if there is a much more efficient refrigerator, we will say, why are you using so much energy, using a very energy intense refrigerator? So equipment and machinery are things that we are assessing. So again, if you look at the value of the inputs, so like I mentioned, how much diesel are we using? How much petrol are we using? So if we can assess those amounts, and it is easy because if you look at the accounts, it will show you exactly how much we are spending on these things. And so this gives us an idea for how to assess the enterprise. And then the tools, that we're using. So we look at proposals. People have written down, we'll do this, we'll do that. So a good review is very important. We also need to make comparative analysis. So for example, Eric is in Denmark. So we can compare a Nepali industry with a Danish industry and say, how come to produce one good in Denmark, it uses much less energy than the one in Nepal? Can we learn from each other? So that is how we will compare. So the basic format also means, like I said, it is important to put numbers. So if we made a list of all the machines that are used in the industry and we look at the wattage, we do the kilowatt hours, we can say this is a waste. There are areas where we can improve. So creating those simple formats to assess the business is also a tool. Now, interviews are also very important. So talking with senior management, talking with accountants, talking with people who actually go to the bank, deposit cash, come back. So when we do these intense interviews, we get a very good insight as to where we can intervene and green, that business. Okay. So you'll see, there are gaps in understanding. So we want to basically build on what people already know. And so like in this webinar also, we'll say, yes, we need to take care of the earth. But what does it mean? So what does it mean to put less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? So there is a general lack of systems thinking. So the example I'm giving you is there might be a poultry farm and they're struggling with what to do with the poultry waste. And the solution is you can put poultry waste in a gasifier, and the gasifier can be connected to a generator. You can generate energy. You can use some of the energy for your own industry, and then the rest you can sell it onto the grid. Okay. So major area of intervention. So water usage, energy efficiency, solid waste management, mobility. So these are things that we are finding out as we look at the pilots in detail. And then the systems thinking that I mentioned, where we don't just look at the industry, but we look at everything that is related. Okay. So that kind of systems thinking is what we're finding out and assessing, and now starting to intervene with trainings and inputs to make a green economy. Next one. So, if you do the initial, assessment, and so this is very encouraging that people will say, yes, we need to sustain ourselves. But somebody who has done a little more deep thinking will say, the reason why my business will not grow is because we don't have enough water. And so in Nepal, water shortage is a big, challenge. The next, example, and so I'm just giving you examples. So if you go from water shortage to water harvesting, if you go from water harvesting to drip irrigation, if you go to how to limit evaporation, right? So there are so many things that we need to look at. So sustainability has now to be defined, and we would like to go deep. And as you go deep, you find out that the concept, of sustainability is sometimes limited, because very often the person wants to run a business, they have to pay their bills, and so they may not have the chance to think deep. And so that limited concept of sustainability is something that we need to build on. So identifying the gaps in the curriculum. Okay, so based on the pilots, okay, people need to know this. Then you look at the curriculum and say, the curriculum is not enough. There is many good things, but not enough. So where can we intervene, the gaps? Okay, so dissemination of information. So yes, I want to source a good quality brick, which is made in a very efficient, brick kiln. So where do I get information? Where do I get the address? Where do I get the phone number? So dissemination of information, becomes very important. So where do I get a submerged, solar pump? And then community mapping. And so somebody mentioned earlier also, so local skills, local knowledge to promote local herbs. And so if you're in Pokhara, I encourage you to go, to a restaurant, and it's just called Local Elements, right? And then there's a restaurant there called Fresh Elements. And so the whole menu, for the restaurant is based on what can be found just in that area. And so what is, the entrepreneur trying to prove? We do not need diesel or petrol to bring ingredients from far away, because we only source local vegetables, plants, herbs. And so there are many good examples. And so maybe in the COVID-19 crisis also, Nepal started sourcing, many raw materials from nearby, which they did not even know existed, because they were used to getting it from far away. But the COVID forced them to look around. And so now people are starting to source things that are close by. Okay, so next slide. So this, is basically, we have to be futuristic. We want to look, into the future. And so the examples, that we're getting, the tools that we're developing, the findings, that we have. So if you look at it, we need to share those learnings as widely as possible. And so this webinar is part of that sharing, that we have started, to do. Now connect with a broad range of stakeholders. So what does that mean? We need to work with the government. We need to work, with the local municipality, because it is the local municipality that is going to charge you for your waste. It is the local municipality that is going to give you connection to water. Okay, the local utility like the NEA, supplies you electricity. And so the stakeholder is not just you. So there are many stakeholders. And so basically connecting to a broad range of stakeholders so that they can again be brought to TVET, share these ideas, and then take them out. And so scaling, as in the TVET becomes an engine of growth, meaning all these stakeholders can come together because TVET exists as an enabler. And so from there, everything can again spread to the rest of the economy. Now, decision making, I think, is very critical because sometimes decisions are made, without really thinking about implications. So we do not want to green an economy where people are jobless. We don't want to green an economy which shuts down the industry. So it is basically to improve it. And so, like I mentioned, now that Nepal has extra hydropower, so a few years back we had power outages, but now more and more clean hydropower is coming online. And so the minister is saying we need to start replacing cooking fuel, which is basically bitumen or, like paraffin. So we need to replace that with clean energy. Now, if you are a TVET graduate, you will also understand that if I start making electric rice cookers or what we call Bijuli Dexi, then the market exists because the government is going to make cooking gas more and more expensive and is going to encourage electric cooking. So in the same way, if you plan to buy two-wheelers, motorcycle for your staff, please buy electric vehicles because the government is now putting more and more electric charging stations. Okay, so that's what we mean by engaging senior decision makers. And then a roadmap. Okay, so roadmap meaning the TVET exists as an institution, Dakchyata is there as a partner. And so if we work together, then there's a nice road ahead that we can map, whereby helping small industries, but doing it collectively so that the total impact that we create is large and it really helps the planet. But then also we can celebrate by saying, yes, I'm doing a little bit, but look at the impact that I'm creating because I'm part of this bigger network. And so the TVET becomes a key part of this, and Dakchyata, which is basically working with TVET to make this happen. And so the partnership that Eric talked about is a critical piece of this design. So next one is basically, to
Yes.
open up the floor, for questions.
Yes,
So,
thank you. So
yeah.
yes, thank you,
Yes,
Anil sir, for your comprehensive presentation. As Anil sir just mentioned, that this is a series of webinar, like first of series of webinar where we are trying to share what's coming out of our partner projects in terms of embedding green growth activities. So this is just the initial capacity assessment. So this webinar is more of an introductory session for relevant stakeholders. So we want to connect and share with our relevant TVET stakeholders on the findings from our partners. With that, we have come to the end of the presentation, right on time, Anil sir. We have 10 more minutes to finish the presentation. So if there's any queries and questions, please use this opportunity to ask the questions, use the chat box, and also please feel free to ask the questions yourself. So we have 10 minutes before we close the webinars. Anyone, if you have questions, please, this is the right time to ask the question.
Yeah. And also use the chat box if you want.
Yes, please.
So
I'm sure there has to be some question, yeah, some interest on that in these areas. Yes, Answer, you were saying something?
So, the questioning culture, to ask questions is also part of the green economy. And because if you do not ask questions, then, we are not really doing justice. And so, like I said, why am I wasting energy? Why am I wasting water? So these are all questions, that we need to ask. So how to encourage people to follow a healthy lifestyle, food, exercise, meditate hikes, and decrease the cost of it. So, this is from Saurabh Sharma. And so I just want to answer this by, basically encouraging you to find a book, and so it's basically, it's a you can find many books like this, but this whole philosophy that poverty in the world really depends on how long you live. Okay, so the reason why I'm doing a webinar is because I was able to get a good education, I was able to work, and then I got to this stage. And the reason is because my grandfather lived to be 93. So if people die early, their children will suffer. And then the reason for poverty is low life expectancy. So it is very interesting that in the United States, which is a very developed country, the life expectancy has actually gone down by 3 years because of exactly what you're saying, because people are not eating healthy. People are not, using, the best things, to support their body. So there are many, ideas in the world, but the idea is if you were to have only one car, for the rest of your life, you would really take care of it. And so the analogy is you have only one body for the rest of your life. And so please take care of it really well, because we don't have a spare body for you. Okay.
Okay.
So this is
Yes,
one
with that
good question.
interesting response, sorry, answer to interrupt. We have a couple of more questions. I'm just keeping mind of the time. So the next one is, can you link green recovery and net zero carbon? So this is a question from Sujata ji.
Sure. So net zero carbon, basically means, so for example, there are trees, there's greenery that can absorb, the carbon dioxide, because the trees use the food, of carbon dioxide. Now they will emit oxygen. And so what that means is if you calculate how much they take and how much I produce, and if the two are equal, then I'm in a net zero, carbon. And so the point is that, yes, you can be a source of carbon dioxide, but you also need to take care of the sink. So which, is basically trees, greenery, wetland. And so the reason to take care of nature is they take the carbon dioxide we produce and gives us a net carbon economy. So if you look at the climate conversation, the whole world is basically trying to become net zero by 2030. So I'm sure Denmark will get there very quickly. But even, countries like the UK and others are setting these goals that by 2030 there'll be net zero. So the next one.
Okay, Anil sir, just before you answer to that question, I also encourage people to ask something relevant to the Tibet and greening Tibet aspect of. I find some of these questions are more generic to green economy, but please do respond to these. And in addition to that, I'd also encourage people to ask something related to, green Tibet, greening of Tibet. So yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So one question is about hydropower and, solar. And so currently, because we're able to produce hydropower in good volume, so like the Tamakoshi, more than 300 megawatts. So the cost per watt, becomes very cheap. But we have to understand that solar power is now becoming more and more efficient, and the batteries that we are using is getting really good. So what does that mean? It means that the Marsangde hydroelectric project will one day be easily replaced by 80 batteries. And so the day when technology can start replacing large plants, so we have to think that things are not remaining the same, and there's a lot of innovation in the world. So next one is, how can we add up G?
Anil sir, I find like some of these questions are more general. I think we can respond to these questions in an email as well, just to keep track of time. Pankaj from STC is raising hand. Pankaj, do you want to ask your questions directly?
Yes. Thank you so much, Rishaji. For me, so in which occupation or green economic sector do you see the opportunities in Nepal in terms of job growth? And in which sector do we need these higher end skills to be required that the TVET institutions like CTVTs could play a role in ensuring there's an adequate supply of adequate human resources?
Right.
So specific sectors and occupations.
Sure. So if we look at the lower end, right, of the economic spectrum, so because of COVID-19, I think now every house in Nepal has a barber, right? Because we stopped going to the barber shop. And so, I don't know why people don't, learn how to cut hair, more often. But the COVID forced people to learn these skills. And so when you think that we are a country of 30 million, people, and so half men, and so they need a haircut, every 2 or 3 weeks. That's a lot of money, going out of the country. So just to give you an example, did you know that for India, Nepal is the sixth largest remittance, source country? So Nepal is the sixth largest remittance country for India, because our construction labor, our hair cutters, they all come from India. So construction is a good example. So if you look at the national budget, just the government's budget, $16 billion, almost 80% is being spent on infrastructure. So you see roads being built, hydropower plants being built. So construction. And so what did the COVID reveal? That 1.5 million jobs are needed with semi-skilled labor just for construction. And this is where we can really make a difference, because again, the way we source the cement, the way we source the construction materials, and the way we manage things. So huge opportunities. Now, electricity generation, which, like many countries in the world, have become rich because they have oil. So Nepal doesn't have oil, luckily, but we have hydropower, which is clean. And so if this energy can be used, to build an economy, so which means producing goods and services using clean energy, then they will become more and more competitive in the world market. So we can go from very simple haircuts to making, finished goods using clean energy. So huge opportunities exist.
And so we'll take one last question before we actually move on to the closing remarks. So Stuart is asking, how are you intending to introduce carbon emission reduction training into the Nepalese TVET system? I think very relevant question.
Yeah. So, Nepal, this is a little, maybe long-winded, but, young people go to the Gulf countries and they send money home. And then the government uses the money to send it to the Gulf countries to import petrol and diesel. How sad, is that? So there is an understanding that we have solar, plenty. We have hydro, plenty. We have biomass. So for example, a tree to grow in Canada takes 80 years. And in Nepal, it will get to the same size in 8 years, because we are close to the tropics and we have a lot of rain. So this kind of energy mix is very critical, because it moves us away, from petrol and diesel and butane or propane. And so this process has already begun. And so as Nepalese, switch to cleaner energy, we will, become a net, zero carbon economy. And because we're also, not emitting too much. And so today, 23% of Nepal is protected areas or national parks. And so we can easily offset, what we produce. So there are huge, movements to move Nepal to become a renewable and clean, energy country.
Yes, Anisa, thank you. We don't have more questions on the chat box. I think this will be the end of the Q&A. Thank you, everyone, for your interest and joining us in the webinar. If you have more queries, please write to us in our corporate email. We'll get back to you with your answers. With this, now we are at the end of the program, and I would now like to request Eric, our team leader, again to share some of his thoughts, provide vote of thanks and close the webinar officially. And from my end, thank you everyone again for joining and sharing your thoughts. Hope to see you again in the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Let me first of all thank everyone for being part of this webinar on TVET as an engine for green growth. Thank you all participants for your contributions and lively participation. And thank you also to our resource person, Mr. Anil Chitrakar. And thank you, Reshu, for the role you have taken upon yourself as moderator for this large group. I think I can say safely that greening TVET is a new field for many of us, but we could also feel from your many comments that's a very interesting subject. We all know that for many reasons, for economic and social reasons, but in fact for the well-being of man, we have to find new ways to draw out less resources and energy from our planet. And when we do use energy, to favor the renewable ways to minimize our green footprint. I think Anilji's example of the 1 watt bulb instead of the 100 watt is illustrative. And I must say, Anilji, you are a wealth of good examples and illustrative examples. So I think this has been very informative and very entertaining also. This transition, TVET should be fully part of that. And that's what we need to reach. And we're not there yet. Today we heard about many new and innovative ways to make TVET an engine for green growth. And these new ways can really inspire us in Dakchyata project to move forward, as I mentioned in the beginning, offering opportunities from promoting the transition to a greener, climate resilient, low emission economy as our mandate prescribes. And some practical and doable ways are these: sharing practical learning and insights among stakeholders in webinars and other events, and in producing learning papers on experiences from our grantees and others is a really good start. Going from the very general towards the more specific, assist in pinpointing roles and responsibility for all key players, explaining what you can do, considering your role and function in TVET seems to be a fruitful way to go. Demonstrating worthwhile actions for TVET practitioners, enablers like the private sector representatives and policymakers and senior decision makers to find ways where TVET as a sector can contribute to greener growth and higher prosperity. These ways look promising, and we are grateful to all of you for coming up with the examples that can deepen this understanding. I think that part has been very fruitful for us in this webinar. So in closing, we have probably mentioned already that this webinar is a part of a series where we in Dakchyata raise important questions in TVET and in public-private partnership relations for further discussion. So we shall soon invite you for the next webinar in our series, perhaps in a month's time or so, subject yet to be decided. In the meantime, stay well, everyone, stay healthy, and do try to protect our environment wherever and however you can. So on behalf of Dakchyata, this webinar is now closed. Many thanks to you all, and see you all soon again. Thank you.
Yes, as I mentioned, we are at the end of the webinar, so we are closing for today. Thank you everyone again.
Bye everybody.